Hello. So, our next book is going to be Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, a book that was written around the turn of the century and deals with a lot of what was happening in the Belgian Congo at the end of the 1800s into the early 1900s. In order to help us understand more about this book, we're going to go ahead and look a little bit about the background of the Belgian Congo and how Conrad came to be aware of what was happening in this part of Africa. To start with, we can consider the name of this short novel, or novella as it's sometimes called, Heart of Darkness. Africa has been referred to as the Dark Continent for several reasons. Part of it has to do with certainly a European perspective, saying that it's dark in the sense that especially Africa's interior is unknown to most Westerners or Europeans. And even though by the time you hit the 1800s, Europeans had been well aware of Africa's coasts for centuries, the interior was still rather mysterious. It was very difficult for Europeans to even survive in the central parts of Africa due to tropical diseases and the difficulty of accessing the jungles. The main way into Africa's interior ended up being the rivers, which is going to be a focus in this book. So there's the sense of going into the dark heart of Africa. Also, there's the darkness in the sense of the skin color of the natives, so a racial connotation. However, this book is also going to take a look at darkness in terms of Westerners going into Africa and thinking about, well, what darkness do they bring with them? What is in their hearts? So when you start reading this and consider the background, you can look at the idea of a heart of darkness in a couple of different ways, and we'll want to consider that as we keep going. So the Belgian Congo is a passage of history that's often overlooked, maybe one of the most terrible things to have happened in African history that most Westerners don't know about. The story really begins with King Leopold II of Belgium. Belgium is not a major power in Europe, but King Leopold is interested in trying to boost Belgium's power and prestige, or at least his personal power. And he believes that acquiring an African colony would be a big part of this. We'll show something later that gives a little more details, but it kind of all starts with him beginning what he calls the International African Association in 1876, an organization promoted and introduced as a philanthropic effort to advance the civilization of the African people in the Congo, along the Congo River, protect them from exploitation from other Arab slave traders, that sort of thing. Of course, it ended up being a lot more sinister. An initial resource that Leopold and his effort sought to exploit was ivory, a very valuable commodity, well prized by people at that time in history as to today. And so he originally set up trading stations along the Congo River and throughout the Belgian Congo, where they tended to exploit natives to gather ivory which they could ship back at a profit. You'll see this in the novel. Later on, the major export was rubber, as the demand for rubber increases. And the project in the Congo then kind of shifts towards forcing Africans to harvest rubber. There was a sort of a private army run by King Leopold and his agents. Leopold himself never actually set foot in Africa. And there's a lot of pictures, really difficult pictures to look at, of people with severed hands. The officers and soldiers in charge of forcing the natives to gather rubber were given a limited number of bullets, and in order to make sure that these soldiers did not waste their ammunition, in a sense, the only reason you should be shooting is if you're shooting at Africans who are not doing what you're telling them to do. So they were told, well, if you shoot somebody, then you have to cut off their hand and bring it back so that we can make sure that you're only shooting at things that are right. Well, of course, a lot of times these guys would shoot at things that weren't Africans. Unfortunately, they shot at the Africans quite a bit as well. But if they wanted to hunt for something, or just they were bored in the jungle, and so every time they shot a round out of their guns, they needed to find somebody's hand to cut off. And so thousands and thousands of Africans were mutilated. And this was just part of the legacy of brutality. If you want to learn more about the background, and we'll show something here in a minute that gives you a little bit bigger picture, but additional resources, Adam Hochschild, I don't know if I'm saying that right, his book, King Leopold's Ghost, has a lot of information, and if you have access to Amazon Prime, you can still see the documentary based on this book, King Leopold's Ghost, which I would highly recommend. It's not for the faint of heart. It shows some pretty terrifying events, but it gives you a good picture of the history of the Belgian Congo from King Leopold's involvement, and the video documentary actually takes the history all the way up into modern times, and it's a lot to be aware of. What we see here gives a quick overview of some of the background.
Going up that river was like traveling back to the earliest beginnings of the world, when vegetation rioted on the earth and the big trees were kings. An empty stream, a great silence, an impenetrable forest. The air was warm, thick, sluggish. There was no joy in the brilliance of sunshine.
When prize-winning author Joseph Conrad wrote his novella Heart of Darkness, a journey into the terrifying depths of man's soul, he turned to the cruelest place on earth for inspiration, the Congo. It wasn't the Congo's inhabitants that made it that way. It was a ruthless succession of outsiders, beginning with Leopold II, a Belgian king with a lust for wealth and a passion for murder.
Leopold was a very frustrated man as the king of a small country. And he had the conviction that to be worth anything in the world, a country had to have colonies. And he was a very single-minded man about that.
King Leopold ascended the Belgian throne in 1865. 9 years later, an American explorer and journalist captivated the world with his stories of peril and pursuit in the farthest reaches of Africa. His name was Henry Morton Stanley.
Stanley had discovered this area, which was the Congo, essentially, and he came back to Europe with the tales of what he'd seen there, the riches, the natural abundance, the ivory, the rubber, the gum, the palms, the trees, the timber, and this got someone very excited. It basically excited King Leopold of Belgium, and he thought, that's what I want.
Leopold was eager for his own piece of the African pie, which was being sliced up into colonies by other European powers, but he had no idea where to start. So in 1878, Leopold turned to Stanley, hoping the experienced explorer could help him take over the Congo. He did. 1 year later, Stanley was back in Africa as King Leopold's agent. He approached the Congo's tribal chiefs with land treaties and tricked over 500 of them into signing.
Obviously, they couldn't read, they didn't know what it meant, and they sold their birthrights for a few beads. It basically meant that they were handing over the rights to their land and the rights to trade, and they were handing that control over to King Leopold. Because what was extraordinary about the Congo was that it wasn't, at the beginning, a Belgian colony. It was essentially personal property of King Leopold II.
While Stanley was in Africa, gobbling up a region 80 times the size of Belgium, Leopold was back in Brussels figuring out how to make his gamble pay off. In 1879, Leopold created a private company whose stated mission was to free the Congolese people from foreign oppressors, namely Arab slave traders who were kidnapping native villagers and selling them into slavery abroad. Leopold assured the world his regime, which he called the Congo Free State, would bring prosperity and fair trade to the Congo. This, he said publicly, was the humanitarian thing to do, but his true goals were far different.
Well, he didn't believe in free trade. He didn't care at all for the indigenous population. He had absolutely no humanitarian ideals whatsoever. His aim was to create a colony for Belgium and make money.
In 1887, a discovery made half a world away would be Leopold's lucky break. Scotsman John Dunlop developed a useful and inexpensive way to revolutionize travel: rubber tires. The Congo was one of only a handful of places in the world where rubber grew wild, and Leopold acted quickly to exploit it. He formed the Force Publique, an army of Belgians and Africans, and got them to force Congolese natives into rubber harvesting. It was dangerous work and required scaling the tops of trees where the valuable vines hung. Leopold's rush to corner the world's rubber market led to a whole new form of slavery in the Congo, and a reign of terror so brutal it would become the worst genocide in African history. It began with a hard leather whip called a chicotte.
They would use the chicotte to punish a Congolese villager who hadn't met his quota, and the chicotte basically flayed open the skin, so that apparently after 20 strokes you were a bloody pulp. And if you had the misfortune to have 50 strokes or 100 strokes, you died. So it became synonymous with Leopold's rule, and it was a horrible, feared instrument of torture.
But to the outside world, the Congo seemed like a perfect colony, profitable, productive, and civilized, all thanks to King Leopold. Meanwhile, inside the Congo, things went from bad to worse. When the rubber workers inevitably collapsed from exhaustion, starvation, or disease, the Force Publique shot them and were ordered to cut off their hands.
The Force Publique were issued with bullets, and the officers who were commanding these mercenaries wanted to see results. So for one of these soldiers not to get punished, if he was sent out with 10 cartridges, he had to have 10 hands of his victims. It's proof that he hadn't wasted his bullets. Often, of course, some of these bullets had been wasted, so there was this extraordinary pictures you get of living Congolese who, while they were still alive, had had their hands severed. Leopold set new standards in colonial brutality. I think he did that because he just was a man in a great hurry, and he didn't think of the Congolese as human.
Few statistics were collected at the time, but estimates put the total number of murdered Congolese at well over 10 million. By 1901, the Congo was one of the world's largest rubber suppliers, and King Leopold profited handsomely. He lived the high life in Belgium and in several chateaux and villas throughout Europe.
Leopold never set foot in what was ironically known as the Congo Free State, and I think that made it easier for him. He could not look face to face with the evidence of what he had done to that country.
This big propaganda ploy really managed to disguise what was really happening in Africa, and King Leopold was able to get away with it. He was able to kill millions, but he still pretend that he was civilizing millions.
Leopold might have prolonged his terror campaign had it not been for a curious and determined clerk in a Liverpool shipping office. His name was Edmund Morel.
Morel looked at the shipping manifests and discovered that while a great deal of rubber and ivory was coming from the Congo, practically nothing was going back. The main items which were carried in the ships going from Antwerp to the Congo were arms and ammunition, which obviously weren't going to be supplied to the Congolese. So that struck him as extremely suspicious.
Once he suspected foul play, Morel was a man possessed. He quit his job and spent the next decade investigating King Leopold's corrupt regime.
Morel was extraordinarily accurate. He was very adept at reading into this sort of boring statistics how much was coming out of the Congo in terms of resources. He would get documents leaked to him by people within Leopold's administration. people who did have consciences, who were concerned at what was going on.
It was a moral issue, I think, for him. There was a robbery going on a grand scale, and he disapproved.
And Morel wasn't the only one watching the Congo. A British diplomat also issued a stinging indictment of King Leopold's system of slave labor, warning it would lead to the total extinction of the Congolese people. Faced with world suspicion, Leopold defiantly proclaimed, "I will not allow myself to be soiled by blood or mud," and began an ambitious counter-campaign.
He would bribe journalists, he would bribe US senators. He would invite people to go to the Congo and would make sure that while they were in the Congo, they only saw the nicest possible aspect of what was going on. So for every step that Morel took, King Leopold was up there meeting it and trying to neutralize it.
But in 1902, profound literary work added its voice to the growing chorus against Leopold. Author Joseph Conrad worked as a sea captain's apprentice on the Congo River in 1890, during the height of the rubber massacres. Conrad was so transformed by the brutality and death he witnessed that he wrote it all down, and it became the basis for his seminal work, Heart of Darkness.
Black shapes crouched, lay, sat between the trees, leaning against the trunks, clinging to the earth in all the attitudes of pain, abandonment, and despair.
He was talking about the darkness which is at the heart of Westerners, white men who go out to places like Africa, and because they are far from their family, their friends, and the strictures of the society in which they have been brought up, they start behaving in ways that would have been inconceivable if they were back home.
They were dying slowly. It was very clear. They were not enemies. They were not criminals. They were nothing earthly now. Nothing but black shadows of disease and starvation, lying confusedly in the greenish gloom.
Conrad intended it to be an absolute blast aimed at the imperialist, colonialist system that had been set up in the Congo and the imperialist Congolese system that was being applied across Africa at that time.
We are going to focus on the literary response captured by this novel. Probably the most famous line of the novel. I don't want to spoil everything that brings you to this point, but one of the main characters, kind of as he's looking at what's going on, has this line, "The horror, the horror." So his reaction to what he's seeing is the horror. And if you remember the difference between horror and terror, terror means the anticipation of something terrifying that may yet come. The horror is a revulsion or response to current, present depravity or pain, or in this case, terrible injustice, tyranny, and oppression. So this has kind of become a theme of Western involvement and exploitation in non-Western parts of the world, and certainly has helped gain this novel's place as an important statement about European involvement in Africa and elsewhere. As we go into the reading, you will have another discussion assignment. This is going to be sort of the real thing, and you're going to have 3 prompts that you can consider, and there's a lot of different questions that we could talk about, but we will get started just looking at some of these as you begin reading. The first question you can choose to consider: what does this level of brutality, the level of brutality described in the novel, do to the humanity of the victims? And you can think about this in terms of how this dehumanizes them or reduces them in the way they're treated to a subhuman level. Kind of following along with that, you could also choose to consider the question, what does it do to the humanity of the perpetrators? So if you are somebody who is not on the receiving end, but dealing out these terrible acts of brutality and inhumanity, what does this do to your own humanity? What does it change about somebody if they grow accustomed to treating people in such a terrible way? And then another quirk of this novel is how few characters actually are given names. Quite a few of them are referred to as the accountant, the lawyer, the pilot. So why do you think so few are given names? A few have names, but many do not. So go ahead and start posting on the discussion forum in response to these prompts, and I look forward to seeing the discussion and conversation that you guys generate. So go ahead and get started with the reading. Look at the instructions about the reading and discussion assignments on the classroom, and we'll be following up and seeing what you guys have to say. Talk to you later.